Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. There are a lot of myths surrounding the massacre at Mountain Meadows. How many people were killed? It turns out that it could be a few dozen fewer than original estimates. We'll also tackle the myth about whether children under the age of 8 were spared because of Mormon theology. Is that really true? Barbara Jones Brown will talk about some of these myths, and I think you'll be enlightened and learn some of these things that come from the latest research on the massacre at Mountain Meadows. Check out our conversation. Please sign up for our newsletter. Go to gospeltangents.com/newsletter, and you can get some of the inside scoops and see who the latest people we are ready to interview. Check out our conversation. So let's get into the massacre itself. So we had, I want to say 117, is that right? Is that the right number?
You know what's really interesting about that number is that number comes from Jacob Hamlin, who buries the bodies later. Jacob Hamlin was not in the Mountain Meadows. He was in Salt Lake City on September 11th, 1857, but he had a ranch at the north end of the Mountain Meadows. So he comes home shortly thereafter, and later he buries the bones. Hamlin guesses that there were 120 victims, and he shares that with federal investigators. And that number, his estimation, is based on the number of bones he counts and that he buries. But the bones are all dismembered. They're spread all over the valley. They're not like single skeletons anymore. So, but that generally became the number of how many people were massacred there based on. So Hamlin predicts that. He tells federal officials that it was 120, and then they go with that number. What's interesting is the earliest sources, the earliest body counts put the number at 95, 96, which surprised me when I started getting into those earliest primary sources, because I said, no, it's supposed to be 120. So then I just thought, well, where does this number come from? And I looked at all of the sources, and they are what I just described to you. So the earliest body counts say about 95 or 96. The number of people who have been identified in the train is about the same. It's about there.
Oh, so it might not be as bad as we thought.
It is as bad as we thought, even if one person was massacred.
That's true.
Yeah, I mean, 95, 120, either way, it's still as bad
as terrible. Yeah.
We thought, and it doesn't lessen the crime in any way, shape, or form. But I just want to share that those early sources have a different number.
A smaller number. Okay.
A different number. Yeah, so I think that's interesting.
That is interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that.
And I think the reason why it matters is, people have been worried about, oh gosh, who are these 25 or so people that have never been identified? There were more people in the train that have never been identified. Well, actually, it may be the case that all have been identified. So, and I hope people don't think that I'm trying to be apologetic by saying there's a different number in these earlier sources. That's not my intent. It's not my intent to lessen the crime in any way, shape, or form, but just sharing the fact that there are earlier sources that have a different number, and it more closely aligns with the number that have been identified, I think maybe could help people feel some, what's the word? Not closure, but just some satisfaction that, okay, actually we have identified everyone who lost their lives there.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about who are the principal people involved in planning it.
So the leaders of the massacre the primary people are Philip Klingensmith, who is the Bishop of Cedar City, Isaac Haight, who is the state president at Cedar City, John Higbee, who is one of Isaac Haight's counselors, and John D. Lee, who lives at Harmony. He was a federal Indian agent. He was called a farmer to the Indians, so he was teaching Paiutes in his area how to farm, and had a very limited knowledge of the Paiute language. So by agent, it meant the government contracted with you to assist the Indians or work with the Indians in some way. And so his responsibility was farmer.
Okay. So John D. Lee, Higbee, Klingon Smith, and Haight. Is that Haight the same as, is he related to David B. Haight?
No, David B. Haight descended from Isaac Haight's brother, or first cousin, I believe. So.
Okay. So there is some sort of a tie there.
Yeah, laterally.
Yeah, okay. So one of the things that really struck me in Juanita Brooks' book was John D. Lee said that they all prayed about about the massacre, which I just I know one of the problems with it is all of the participants tried to cast blame on others and not on themselves. But do we have any indication on whether that was true? Did they really get together and pray, and God told them that they should participate in this massacre?
Well, no, God definitely did not tell them to participate in the massacre. So you have the siege going on at the Mountain Meadows. The immigrants were initially attacked on September 7th, Monday. And what they do is they hunker down. They create a bulwark of their wagons. They circle their wagons and dig a pit in the center of the encirclement where they are hunkering down in there in order to survive. And unfortunately, the spring that they camped nearby is out of reach, and they're not able to obtain water, so it's quickly becoming a desperate situation. In the meantime, so other immigrant trains had had their cattle raided. And in fact, there's another raid that happened shortly after this of the Turner and Dukes and Collins party that I was talking about earlier. They have their cattle raided shortly after this. But with all of those, no one is killed, and the cattle are simply run off. And then the immigrant trains continue on their journey. This train hunkered down and created this wagon fort.
Do we know who took the cattle? Was it the Indians? Was it the Mormons?
Oh, the Mormons got it.
The Mormons got the cattle.
Yes.
Now, did they try to get the Indians to attack?
Yes.
So that they could make it look like it was an Indian attack?
Just like with all of these other raids that are taking place, you had Native Americans participating. But this was all, I like to keep the focus on the white settlers who are carrying this out because they deserve the blame. Yeah. So I like to keep the focus on them. So yes, they did encourage others to participate with them so that they could blame them. Right? This was part of that strategy I was talking about.
Were the Indians pretty aware of this, that they were being used by the Mormons?
After the fact. Well, during the siege, some of them become angry and they said, look, we're not going to do this dirty work alone, in the white man's words of the telling. And so Lee calls for reinforcements. And so Isaac Haight, who's not only the Cedar City State President, but also a militia major, he calls out militiamen from Cedar City and sends them out to the Mountain Meadows. Also down in Washington, which was a little town, kind of their forerunner to St. George, there's a settlement at Washington. About 12 to 15 militiamen from Washington come up from the south and come up to the Mountain Meadows as well. All told, there are believed today to have been about 50 to 60 Mormon militiamen there. So they are there at the Mountain Meadows during the siege, kind of waiting for instructions as to what they are to do. And a directive comes from Isaac Haight, who was consulted with William Dame, who is the state president at Parowan and also the militia commander of the Iron County Militia. He is the only one that has more authority than Isaac Haight in southern Utah. So Haight goes to him for permission to call out the militia and to finish off, if you will, the massacre. Haight tells Dame that there's not that many survivors left because this is a message that Lee had sent to Haight. In fact, there were dozens of people still surviving in that wagon fort, most of them children. So Haight sends out the final militiamen with a directive to decoy the immigrants out of their corral by telling them that the militiamen the militiamen are there to save them from the Indians.
Okay, so let's back up. So September 7th is when the initial attack happens, and is that by Indians?
I didn't answer your question yet about the prayer.
Okay. We'll get to that in a minute.
All right.
We'll stay where we are.
Okay.
So let's just get the timeline. So September 7th, there is some sort of an attack. And is that by Mormons or by Indians, or a combination?
By combination.
A combination. So the Mormons are kind of using the Indians as a front.
Yeah, which again happens throughout that summer and fall on multiple wagon trains.
Okay, so September 7th, the Fancher-Baker party circle their wagons, they dig a pit, they're running out of water. So people are dying already before any shots are fired?
So in that initial attack, a number of immigrants are killed in that first initial attack. And then there are attempts of people to get to the water who are killed.
Okay, because they're desperate for water.
So they're becoming very desperate. And of course, after 5 days, they're running out of ammunition as well.
Okay. So there was some initial deaths. Okay, so September 11th, the state presidency / militia, is this the Nauvoo militia, Nauvoo Legion?
Yeah, so the militia in Nauvoo had been called the Nauvoo Legion, and so they kept that name when they started the Utah militia. They still called it the Nauvoo Legion.
Okay, so...
long before 1857.
Okay, so, and I'm getting my names mixed up already. So, Haight was the state president, and Dame was the leader of the militia?
So, Haight was state president of Cedar City and a militia major in the Iron County militia. William Dame was a state president at Parowan, north of Cedar City, and he was the Iron County militia commander.
Okay.
So he is the only one who was senior above Haight.
Okay, so we've got two state presidents,
Right.
both in the militia. One's a major, one's the leader, and the leader is Dame from Parowan.
Exactly.
Okay.
And at that time in the United States, you had militias throughout the U.S. So having a local militia was not unique to the Mormons or to Utah. And basically, once you're a man 18 years or older, you were just automatically in the militia.
Okay. And so they were doing some drills for this Utah war, kind of previous to that. So we've got so September 7th, the Fancher party is surrounded. They circle their wagons. Some people have already died. Other people died trying to get water. And then Dame and Haight get together and say, well, what are we going to do about this situation? John D. Lee says there was a prayer. Is that...
So Haight goes up to Parowan to get permission he has to have permission from Dame as the militia commander to call the troops out and to commit this final massacre, if you will. So he goes to Dame, who's his superior in Parowan, gets the permission from Dame to go ahead and finish it off. Haight comes back to Cedar City, and then he sends out the final number of militiamen with the message that they are to finish this off. So they go out on Thursday, September 10th, to the Mountain Meadows, and they bring the message that they're to decoy out the immigrants by pretending to be there to rescue them, to save them from the Indian attack that they're under. And so they go in, and John D. Lee goes into the corral, and he says, I'm an Indian agent, I'm here to protect you. All you need to do is turn over your arms, because the Indians are mad at the men who have killed some of their number. They're not mad at the women and children. So what we're going to do is we're going to have the women and children march out of the corral first. Then behind them the men, and each man, because he will have given up his gun, each man will have a militiaman as an escort to walk next to him and protect him, an armed militiaman. So this was very treacherous, really horrific.
Right.
Promising to be their saviors. So that's what they do. They march out in that fashion.
So they march them in out one by one. Each Mormon has a Fancher
man. They're walking out.
Again, they're not all Fanchers.
Yes.
It's just a small part of
I'm just
But
abbreviating.
an immigrant man is probably
Yes,
more
an immigrant
accurate.
man. Okay.
Yeah.
So they're walking out. The women and children are behind.
No, they go out first. So
The women and children go out first?
First, you have two. So once Lee convinces the immigrants to accept this plan.
And I'm sure this didn't go over very well with them. We're
No,
giving up
there
our
was
arms? Are you
we
serious?
have, stories of a debate. Lee tells of a debate that took place among them that, some of the men are saying, don't do this. If you do this, you're a damn fool. They're going to kill you. But the other men say, well, they're here promising peace. Why would they lie to us? And really, they're so desperate. You can imagine 5 days in the heat without water, and you've got lots of little children, babies, young children, all of these people just suffering, just holed up in this small little enclosure for 5 days. You can only imagine the suffering. So they're desperate. And I imagine some of them must have thought, well, this is our only chance. This is our best hope. So they agreed to it. They agreed to the plan. So once they agreed to it, two Mormon wagons, two wagons driven by two militiamen, drive into the enclosure, and all of the immigrants' guns are loaded into one of the wagons, and then some other possessions into another wagon, and then some of the wounded who are unable to walk are placed in the wagons as well, and some women possibly carrying, youngest children. So the Lee goes out first with the two wagons out front, followed by women and children on foot, and then finally men and older teenage boys walk out last. And the women and children pass by, and the immigrant men are all lined up. The Mormon militiamen are lined up on the road waiting for them, each one carrying a gun. And the immigrant men come up alongside and stand next to them. And then they start marching out that way. And there's one really sad story. One of the perpetrators tells that some of the immigrant men, when they reached the Mormon militiamen, they gave a cheer, thanking them for rescuing them. There's another story of one younger man turning around and going back into the enclosure saying that, I don't trust this, but they had to convince him, come on, you'll be fine. So just some really heartbreaking stories like that.
And so then there was some sort of a signal. Do we know who gave that signal?
John Higbee.
Oh, it was Higbee, it wasn't Lee. I thought I'd heard it was Lee.
No, it was Higbee. So Lee is at the front of the two wagons, and they march north about a mile or so. And when they reach that given point, Higbee, who is riding on a horse in between the women and children and the men, who are roughly a quarter mile apart from each other, he's riding on a horse in between, and he gives the signal to begin the slaughter.
And that was do your duty or something to that effect?
That's a story that came up later, a legend, but all of the perpetrators said that the signal was halt. He yelled, halt! And then each militiaman turned and shot the immigrant man to their left.
That's horrible. So I thought I had heard that the women and children were left to the Indians, but is that not true?
So there was an Indian interpreter named Nephi Johnson, and he was instructed. He gave multiple affidavits after the fact, and he was instructed to tell the Indians, because he was fluent in Paiute, Nephi Johnson, to take them north to. There was a place where the trail crossed through a very thickly wooded area of sagebrush, and it passed through there, and he was instructed to take Indians to that area and hide there, where they would be instructed to dispatch, the euphemism they use, the women and children. But white men helped kill the people in the wagons and also helped to kill women and children. So again, I like to keep the focus and the onus of this crime with them. But So everyone was brutally murdered except for 17 of the youngest children. The oldest was 6 who survived. Most of them were babies who were spared.
It's just horrible. And I understand a lot of these babies were adopted out by Mormon families.
Yeah, so the 17 children were placed with Mormon families for a brief time, and then once the federal appointees did come into Utah in 1858, they started investigating the massacre, and the Young's replacement as Indian superintendent, his name was Jacob Forney, he has Hamlin come and report that he reports the massacre, but Hamlin reports it as an all-Indian massacre in June 1858. Forney instructs Hamlin to gather to find all of the children wherever they are and gather them to his home at the Fort Clara Fort, and where Jacob Forney goes and retrieves them from Hamlin, brings them back to Salt Lake City eventually, where they're sent east and reunited with relatives in Arkansas.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, let's jump back again. We still haven't talked about this prayer.
Yeah.
So what can you tell us about that?
So, backing up, after Haight gets permission from Dane to commit this act, he sends out the final militiamen, and they arrive on Thursday night with the plan of what they're going to do. They're going to decoy out the immigrants and then slaughter them. And so the militia leaders, Lee describes that they sat in a circle and discussed this plan and talked about it and prayed about it, he says. So then immediately before the act takes place, they put them in what's called a hollow square, a square formation, where the leaders in the center say, this is what you're going to do. And the rank and file never have a chance to discuss it or anything. They're told, and then they just start lining up, and then they stand there while the negotiations are going on within the corral, and then they carry out the crime.
Do we have a sense of how many people participated in this? How many Mormons?
About 50 to 60.
50 to 60. Okay. Wow. Do you think there really was some sort of a prayer, or is Lee just making that up?
I have no reason to question it. There's no historical evidence that would show that it didn't happen. So it's very likely it did happen.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then the other question I wanted to ask, so you said that the oldest child that lived was 6?
Yes.
I know that there's some Mormon theology. Why 6 years old?
Yeah.
And under?
So the attorneys, the non-Mormon attorneys that investigated and talk about it later, it says because they were too young to give evidence in court.
Oh, really? Oh, I always thought it was because children under 8 are not capable of sinning.
That theory came much later.
Oh, okay.
It's a modern theory. And it doesn't hold up because babies were killed. Some babies were killed at the massacre, and 7-year-olds were killed. And again, the oldest survivor was 6. So what all of the perpetrators said was they were too young to tell tales. And again, there's a federal district judge named John Cradlebaugh, and he says they were spared because they were too young to give evidence in court.
Okay, so it was a legal issue, it wasn't a theological issue.
That's what the historical sources say. Yeah, I can't find a single historical source that says, oh, we're not going to kill them because they're not 8 yet. There's not a single historical source that says that. That's a modern theory.
Oh, wow.
So, and again, it doesn't hold up because you have children younger than 8 who were killed.
Okay, so it was really more of a legal issue. You can't have a 6-year-old testify in court.
That's what Judge John Cradlebaugh said.
Oh, wow, that's interesting.
And the Mormon sources, they just say too young to tell tales is the language they use.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Barbara Jones Brown. We're not done tackling myths just yet. We'll talk about some other myths. Is it true that Mormons were actually stealing cattle from immigrants?
Mormons have a history of cattle rustling, it sounds like.
Well, again, this was Brigham Young's strategy, his war strategy, to try and convince the federal government that if if the government removed him as Indian superintendent and governor of Utah and ran the Mormons out, this is what would happen. The immigration would be no longer safe.
And so this is kind of
part of his
this is kind of his strategy, and so he's making it not safe.
Yeah,
essentially.
He's encouraging it. Yeah, he's encouraging this cow raiding.
Please subscribe at patreon.com/gospeltangents. For $5 a month, you can hear the entire interview uncut. So please subscribe at Patreon or on our website at gospeltangents.com as well. For our latest updates, please like our page at facebook.com/gospeltangents. And also check our Twitter updates at Gospel Tangents as well. Please subscribe on our Apple Podcasts page at tinyurl.com/gospeltangents, or you can subscribe on your Android device. Just do a search for Gospel Tangents. Thanks again for listening. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here we've got some more of our great videos. Thanks again.